world without end always reminds me that we are travelers on this infinite train, but only for a few stops. I want to start with a story about a man who was dying, suffice it to say, maybe an appropriate story. He called his family in. He said he believed they were wrong, that you couldn't take it all. He thought you could take it with him. So he sold everything when he died, and he wanted them to bury all his cash with him in his coffin. They thought he was crazy, but they did it anyway, and he died, and he went up to the hereafter, and the angels met him at the gate, and he said, "Here I am, and here's all my money." And the angels looked at him, and they said, "Didn't you learn the lesson that we only take receipts here?" Now that's an old folk tale, but here's another one. It's about an old woman who had what she needed. She had more than she needed. In fact, she could never use it all. Her children had grown and passed on. She was so old now that she had seen her children go. Her grandchildren didn't exist because her children never had them. But she had loved so many children as a teacher. She saw them grow and graduate and go on to live their lives. Now she watched from her porch her tomatoes grow. Some made it to her table, and some made it to the neighbor's table, and others fell, like some of her students, to nothing. But she thought a long time about that. She watched her tomatoes, and days she couldn't hoist her body out to the garden. She watched them drop like slow rain. She realized they weren't wasted if they didn't end up in a salad or stuffed and cooked in the oven. She realized they were doing what they were supposed to do, planting the next generation, fertilizing the seed within them with the rotting tomato flesh. And she was fine with that. Her neighbors would say she let the drops go to waste. And Mr. Davis, who came once a week from church and made coffee and mostly talked about himself, said she should collect them. But she was through with oughts and shoulds. She was enjoying the notion that some of her crop would feed her friends and some would feed the soil. And one day, on one of those days when Mr. Davis was waxing on about something he had done on a roof of a house somewhere in Georgia and how he wasn't hurt when he fell off, she had an idea. What if her life were like those tomatoes? Once she had fed many with her words and lessons. Now she was more like the fruit that hit the ground. Could she nourish an environment for others to thrive in? So she called her financial advisor, and he said she was crazy and she would starve, and she said she would get along and he should stop worrying about her. So with his help, she sold everything. She sold her stocks, her bonds, her car. She never drove her books, her art, her furnishings, and her house. But she sold her house with one condition: that she could live in the garden shed, which had room for a bed and had running water, that she could continue to grow her garden. And the family that bought the house agreed and moved in, and she moved into the shed, which was no bigger than a couple of closets. But what did she need anyway? The children that moved into the house came to see her, curious about the resident in their backyard. She showed them how to tie up the vines and to prune the leaves and let the sun in. She helped them dig soil and bring in the vegetables, and they set up a farm stand out front and sold the tomatoes, and she asked them to keep the money that they earned. And her days passed watching the garden grow and the children learn and lend a hand. And the neighbors thought she had lost her mind and stopped coming by, and Mr. Davis was uncomfortable in the cramped quarters and abandoned his soliloquy visits. And the woman enjoyed the peace of watching her garden grow, even though she had sold everything she owned except 2 outfits and her little garden. And when she died, the children in the family scattered her ashes among the tomato plants. And then one day, a week or so after her memorial, they got a box addressed to the house with no name on it. The box was light, but they could feel that there was something inside. So they took it into the dining room table, and inside the box were thousands of letters, all addressed to the old woman. They were thank you letters from children. They were from children who were students at a school in a rough part of the city where the woman had grown up. They wrote to say how grateful they were to the old woman for creating such a perfect school where they could learn how to grow plants and study math and English and peace studies. You see, the old woman had sold everything she owned and created a school that was in a place that needed it most. She had passed on to the school 2 charters. One, always have a garden to teach the children how to grow things, and 2, that they use the curriculum that she had created over 50 years of teaching on the study of peace. The family read thousands of letters. They wept through most of them and laughed at the pictures of children that drew faces on tomatoes and larger-than-life stink bugs eating corn. And they decided to honor the old woman and do one more thing. So they took all the cards and letters and they stapled every single one of them on the walls and ceiling inside the shed, created like a jewel box decorated by crayon drawings of smiling vegetables and happy slugs. And then they invited the children from the school to come visit, and one class at a time of 5- and 6-year-olds came and marveled at the shed as they found their cards on the walls, and they toured the garden and could name every plant. And then they sat on the porch, and year after year, they heard the story of the founder of their school, who sold everything for them. So who got into heaven? The man who buried his cash with him, or the woman who sold everything? Any? It's actually a trick question because we're universalists. Everyone gets into heaven if you believe in heaven. But the real question is what heaven died in each person, not what happened when they died and went to heaven. Peace of mind, maybe. Sense of purpose. The woman knew she had done well in her life. The follow-on question here is, what did the family do? We hope that the children would learn the same lesson in that family, and then they would perpetuate that on to the students, and so on and so on. The lesson that we can have an impact in our lives. And this begs the question personally about what spiritual lessons did you learn about the values of money? If we ask Lynn Unger's question from the reading today, what do you owe? What is yours? What is yours to do? Those are spiritual questions to ask today. I learned in my upper middle class family of 6 Christian, Jewish, Buddhist Unitarians that we gave away 10% of what we earned. How did that happen? We never were taught to tithe, but my family always gave 5% to the Unitarian church that we belonged to and 5% to organizations we thought were doing good in the world. I learned this so firmly that I practice it today, somewhat to my wife's discomfort. But more than the lesson of percentages, what I learned is that while some of my earnings are mine, ultimately it's the receipts that make a difference. We don't have to go too far to know that generosity makes us feel good. The University of Zurich did a study that was published in Time magazine where they found that those who had agreed in the experiment to spend more money on other people tended to make more generous decisions throughout the experiment compared to those who spent it on themselves. They had more interaction between the parts of their brains that associated altruism and happiness. They reported higher levels of happiness overall, and in fact, they reported greater health and reduced stress. And in the end, longer life and lower blood pressure, and what could be bad about that? I've often pondered the effects of generosity on myself. I've told you numerous times about difficult moments in my life that were healed by generosity. One time, in a difficult moment, I called my father and he told me to give something away. I think of all those acts that you do, the coffee you bring your coworker, the door you hold for the stranger, the donation to a cause, makes you feel good. But deep down, the effects of generosity can be great and can be small on your life and the lives around you. They can alter the world that we live in. Think of this church. Last week, I spread the ashes of Don Janik in our memorial garden. I don't know, maybe some of you don't know that we do that. But his wife, Joan, and his daughter came from North Carolina, and we sprinkled Don on the plants and on the soil. Don was a member here for many years before he and his wife moved to North Carolina. Don was always generous and quiet in a very solid way. He helped this church. Dan Butler, another member, told me that Don was the only person that they sent to canvass Gail Fogelson, who was a member of our church, stepson of Greer Garson Fogelson. Gail died a couple years ago. Now, if you didn't know Gail, you don't know how prickly he could be. I think he hung up the phone on me many times. But he could also be very kind. I enjoyed moments with Gail. But if you just took the image of the hardest person you know to ask something of, that would be Gail. And so Don Janik, a quiet, simple man who liked art and music and went to the same coffee shop every day like clockwork, whereas when he pulled up to the coffee shop, they walked out with his coffee. He was that consistent. He was sent by the Canvas team here to go talk to Gail each year. And Gail would give generously. He was one of our largest donors. Joan and I laughed about this because Joan didn't know that story. Don never told her about the important work that he did to help sustain this place. His work lives on after both he and Gail are gone. And both of their estates have made generous, lasting gifts to the church. This kind of thing has repeated itself over and over throughout the years of this church since 1899. When this person, Daniel Limbaugh, took a flying leap and came here to Dallas to preach to a small gathered group of Unitarians, these people, and you thought it was hard to be a Unitarian in 2018. Daniel Limbaugh and this group created a progressive home for liberal values in Dallas, Texas in 1900 and 1901, 1902. And I call him and them courageous. And he and this group formed this church. What did they know of us? I'm sure they couldn't imagine us. But they raised money, they paid their minister $890 a year, which adjusted for inflation, I did the research, is $25,000 a year today. No wonder they had 5 ministers in 9 years. But all the same, they gathered liberals and progressives throughout the DFW area, so they could be this. In their own way, they knew what we know, that the church is about the important work of strangers meeting on common ground, facing the fear of those encounters and the fear of the day, sharing abundance and generating common responsibility, dealing with conflict and giving life to something with a festive air, with drama, with education, with magic boxes and song. They knew what we know, that this place draws us out and engages us in ways that few other places do, where mutuality is valued and opinions made audible and held accountable and vision projected onto projects and classrooms and marches and protests and dialogues and budgets, where God's purpose is attempted at and we see in the purpose of our making justice and compassion real, there's something holy. And here we run a marathon. I said to one of our donors the other night, when political campaigns you're invested in come and go, know that they are running sprints, important sprints, but we here are running world-changing marathons to change hearts and minds. Here, people are empowered. From the youngest of us who dance in the aisles during the prelude, to the questions of great concepts in class, to the eldest who with their presence remind us what is important: receipts. So today we ask you to pledge for 2019 and fulfill your pledge for 2018. A pledge is a promise to help co-create this place, a place of wise minds, as we've said, of truth speaking, of whole hearts and helping hands. And if you all do what I do and Aaron does and Beth do, and a few of you do, and pledge 5% of your income, the place would explode with possibility. And I know you're saying, well, I don't have a lot. And I say 5% of nothing is nothing. Okay, fine. But whatever you do, do it with joy. Make it feel good. What I'm saying today is that giving is important, but even beyond giving is impact. Joining a mission to create revolutions of the spirit that last longer than the political term, that combat despair and lift up those in need and march in the streets for justice and challenge the status quo with love. What we do is embody a spirit that we pass down to others that says, like the poet said today, there is no one but us. There never has been. These people knew that, and these people know that. I imagine that these people could not imagine us, and these people cannot imagine the church 100 years from now. Who will they be? It's impossible to know. It is for them as it is for us. But they didn't stop. They gave us this place, this splendor, the joy that we experience here. And they knew, as Lynn Unger said in her reading, if not for the responsibility, do it for the joy. We co-create this church every day. We commit to it, and today is a day to commit and pledge. Sign a pledge of love. We who with courage see its value, make it so, and make a difference here, like a woman who sells everything and opens a school for generations to learn and to be enthralled by a story. May you be participants here like that. Investors in the spirit of hope that this place can be for us and for those who have yet to arrive here. May it be so today and always that we might have life and have it more abundantly. Amen and amen.